The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Gospel of Thomas.
Glory to you, Lord.
Just a few remarks before I begin reading it. You've heard the Gospel of Thomas read many, many times now over the last several years, so you're coming to the conclusion that the Gospel of Thomas is very different from the four canonical Gospels. It doesn't tell stories. It's literally just 113 little aphorisms or sayings of Jesus. And so typically when you read it, there are 9 or 10 different topics spoken of in any one reading. And so today I just pruned it. I pruned out, and because I wanted to identify just a single theme. So it's going to be a fairly short reading, but the theme will be fairly consistent. Jesus says, "Whoever does not hate his father and his mother as I do, cannot become my disciple. And whoever does not love his father and his mother as I do, cannot become my disciple. For my mother gave me falsehood, but my true mother gave me life." Jesus says, "Whoever knows the father and the mother will be called the child of the whore." Jesus says, "When you make the two into one, you will become true human beings." Gospel inspired by God. How many times have you woken up in the morning and said to yourself, "That was a really weird dream"? We all have this experience, right? So on the 14th of July, just a few weeks ago, I woke up early in the morning and I said to myself, "Wow, that was a really, really weird dream." And the dream was very short. In the dream, I was teaching some kind of a class to a group of people, and somebody asked me a question, and I heard myself saying in the dream, "This calls for a radical illuso-lucidity." And then I woke up and said, "What in God's name does that mean?" This calls for a radical illuso-lucidity. So I went out and I started writing the dream down. I started thinking about it. What in God's name does this mean? And I began to try to parse the individual parts of it. Obviously, radical comes from the word roots, core. So radical has to do with some kind of a core. And illuso, obviously, is from a form of illusion. And lucidity has to do with clarity. And so I figured out a radical illuso-lucidity means somehow coming to the realization at a deep core level, in the middle of an illusion, that it is an illusion. That was the sense I could make out of it. So a radical illuso-lucidity means that in the middle of an illusion, I suddenly realize at the core of my being that this is an illusion. So I said, okay, that makes sense to me. And then I began to work with it a little bit and think more about it. Now, when I use the word illusion, I don't mean that an illusion for me doesn't mean that something is not true. I don't mean that. When I think of an illusion for me is to think that this is the only reality. But I don't believe that any form of reality is the only form of reality. So anything I can think about, anything I can feel, anything I can imagine, anything I can dream about, exists at some level of reality. So in the sense of illusion is not something that's not real for me. It just means that I have come to the realization that an illusion, the illusion is that this is the only form of reality, or this is the primary or the most pristine form of reality. So a radical illuso-lucidity means for me that in any state of consciousness, I come to the realization at the core of my being that this is not the only kind of reality, or it is not the primary kind of reality. And so in that sense, I believe that what we're experiencing right now, with our eyes wide open, what we call waking consciousness, that this too is an illusion. And I don't mean it's not real. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is the illusion would be if we felt that this was the only kind of reality, or that this was the primary kind of reality. It is not. The primary kind of reality is mediated not by the ego, but by the soul. So as long as we're mediating at the level of ego, we're not in pristine reality. We're in a form of reality, but it's just a kind of reality. So I'm going to pick up on that theme today because there needs to be some kind of an evolution in our core understanding of ourselves if we're to go beyond the illusions into the core pristine reality where we're really identified with God and with soul. So I'm going to make four main points this morning. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the evolution of life. Then I'm going to talk about the evolution of Jesus. Then thirdly, I'm going to talk about the evolution of family. And then fourthly, the evolution of love, when they're addressing this theme. So the evolution of life, we all know at this stage that we live in an evolving universe. 3.7 billion years ago, there were just bacteria on planet Earth. The first life forms on this planet, as far as we know, were just single-celled bacteria and protozoa. And then at some stage, they began to congregate in little clusters and became multicellular creatures. So the first organisms came in, which was a bunch of cells deciding to live in community. And then at some stage, you got real living organisms. And at some stage, there was an evolution, and you got families of organisms, like human beings or chimpanzees or whatever. And then at some stage, we get the notion of a tribe, and then the notion of a nation, and then the notion of a species, that all human beings have something in common. And then we begin to realize that it's bigger even than the species. That life itself is bigger than any one species. And then once we understand what life is about, realize there are many different dimensions, that life exists in many different dimensions. So the model continues to expand. And it expands in a macrocosmic fashion, and in some senses it expands in a microcosmic fashion. So if we want to begin with a cell and we go in the opposite direction, we're going to find out that cells are composed of molecules, and molecules are composed of atoms, and atoms are composed of subatomic particles. You break it down further, and you're at energy, and finally you're at the quantum vacuum, or the zero-point field. So no matter which direction you go, there's this extraordinary clustering. And at each stage of this, there's a shadow part. At every stage of this identification and this evolution of life, there's a shadow part. Because in order to grow, life needs to experience bifurcation points. And depending on how it responds to the bifurcation point, it'll increase in complexity or it'll go towards entropy. And in some senses, shadow is the invitation to make the leap into more complexity or to grow nearer to God. But as life evolves, shadows get more dangerous because the opportunities are bigger. And so, for instance, at the level of an organism, a shadow looks like a cancer. So at the level of cells, an individual cell or a cluster of cells decides to go kind of rogue on the rest of the organism, and then we develop cancers in our bodies. At the level of a family, there's the black sheep of the family. Maybe even a psychopath in the family, that some member of the group, is totally different from the others and is antisocial in some fashion. So that's kind of the shadow of the family system. You get at the global community, you get rogue nations, that an entire nation who sets out to exploit others or to dominate others or to conquer others. And so this is the shadow writ large at the level of international relationships. And at the level of a species, you would get even rogue species. Species that think that they own the planet. Species that think that it is their right to exploit everything and to dominate everything, and then they're really dangerous. So the more complex the organism becomes, the more dangerous the shadow becomes, and the greater the opportunities for light become as well. So a rogue species is much more dangerous than a rogue individual. And a rogue, very highly developed species is much more dangerous than a less sophisticated species, even if it's rogue as well. So if we have extraordinary technology, we're a species with great technology, we're more dangerous, or can be more dangerous than a species that doesn't have a technology like ours. So as we continue to evolve, the opportunities for light and the opportunities for dark also increase. Because it is in this fashion that the bifurcation points, giving us the choices for great evolution and movement towards spirit, arise. And in the absence of those kinds of choices, it's not possible. In the absence of the ability to choose between good and evil, there's no ability to experience compassion, or to move into free will, or to move into freedom. So that's a necessary part of the trajectory. Now, the question becomes, with what level do I identify? So at the core of every one of these levels of expansion, there's some kind of an innate core sense of self. But for most of us, we identify this core sense of self merely with the ego. And very, very often, the ego is trained by the cultures, and particularly in our Western cultures, it's trained to be fearful and acquisitive and angry and anxious And so at the core sense of ourselves, there's this tremendous insecurity, often for cultural reasons. When we disidentify with the ego and we learn to identify instead with the soul, then we're immediately in contact with the compassion and the love that is our real birthright. So it becomes very important with what level of the self do I identify. And so as we move on in this complexity, every new stage is an invitation to a new level of identification, a new level of self-identity. And every level of this process also gives us different survival tools, because the stakes of the game get higher and higher. So old survival techniques are not going to work for a species that's evolved to the next stage. So as we change our sense of identity, we change as well our survival skills and our thriving skills. And the movement should be, if we're awake, closer and closer to identification with Source. That we understand that even the soul itself is an illusion. It's the first illusion on the way out from God, and it's the last illusion on the way back into God. Because ultimately, the soul itself is really a game that God is playing. Ultimately, there is only God. So when we can finally let go of the identity of ego and identification, even with soul, then we can merge with Source. So that for me seems to be the trajectory of life, the evolution of life. Within that now, I look at the evolution of Jesus, both how others understood him and how he understood himself. So I did a quick look through the Gospels this morning, very, very quick survey of the Gospels this morning, and I'm trying to trace out what this evolution looks like. And the first place I landed on was in Mark's Gospel. It's the first of the canonical Gospels written about 70 AD. And there's a statement in Mark chapter 3, verse 21. After Jesus has just begun his public ministry, his family are really, really embarrassed. And we're told in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, his family came to seize him by force because they thought he had gone mad. So the first reaction is they think that this nice kid, who was a nice little boy growing up, has flipped his lid. He's gone paranoid. He has delusions of grandiosity. He thinks he's the Christ, and here he is now preaching. And so they go to grab him. In the very next verse, in chapter 3, verse 22, scribes come up from Jerusalem to try to figure out who this new preacher guy is. And their conclusion is not just that he's mad, but that he's possessed by Beelzebul, the prince of demons. He's not just crazy, he's demon-possessed. And he's not just demon-possessed, he's possessed by the prince of the demons himself, Beelzebul. In chapter 3, verse 31, just 10 verses later, his mother and his brothers come, and he's inside in the house teaching a group of people, and they can't get in because there's a packed group, and they send in a message, and somebody says to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside and they want to talk to you. And Jesus' response was, who is my mother? And who are my brothers and sisters? My mother and my brothers and sisters are those who hear the word of God and keep it. So he's making some kind of a distancing between himself and his family of origin at this stage. Now it gets even more complex. In Mark chapter 6, in verses 1 to 6, it goes further. He now goes back to his own village, and he's starting preaching in his own village. And this is too much altogether. And so we read in Mark chapter 6, verse 1 to 6, they say, who does this guy think he is? Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary? Aren't his brothers living with us? Joseph and Judas and Simon and his sisters, aren't they living here in the village with us? Who in God's name does he think that he is? Now, we miss completely the full import of this as we read it in English, and not knowing the history of the times. To identify Jesus as the carpenter, the son of Mary, was in fact saying that Jesus was illegitimate. He was, in the Hebrew word, a mamzer. When you identify a man at that period of time as son of a woman, you're indicating there is no father. And so this was a real put-on. Who does this guy think he is? Isn't he the carpenter, the son of Mary, i.e. a mamzer, an illegitimate kid? And don't we know his brothers and sisters, and they're living here with us? Who in God's name does he think that he is? So it's a real put-down. They're literally calling him a bastard. And they're hauling him down. Who does he think he is to preach to us? He's illegitimate. Now, by the time this story gets to Matthew's version, 10 years later, Matthew tries to soften it. So when the same incident is related in Matthew's gospel, Matthew does it differently. Matthew says, isn't this the carpenter's son? So now he's legitimizing Jesus. He doesn't say, isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary? He says, isn't this the carpenter's son? So he's now trying to make Jesus legitimate. And then he goes on and says the same thing that Mark did. Don't we know his brothers and sisters? And he names the 4 brothers, and he mentions who the sisters are. So at this stage, they're trying to, repatriate Jesus a little bit, take the stigma of illegitimacy away from him. But, it's going to hang over him for the rest of his life. You get to John's Gospel, and in John chapter 7, it's the Feast of the Tabernacles, and his brothers say to him, are you going to go down to Jerusalem? If you want to make a name for yourself, there's no point in being up here in the sticks. You can't be preaching privately if you want to be known publicly. Come down to Jerusalem with us. And then John adds in parentheses, in actual fact, his family did not believe in him. So by John chapter 7, they still don't believe who he is. Now by the end of John's Gospel, things will have changed significantly. And at the end of John's Gospel, there's the beautiful story in John chapter 19, where Jesus is dying on the cross, and he looks down at the remnant of his followers who've had the courage to follow him to the cross. And there's only one man there, John. And there's Mary of Magdala, and there's his mother Mary. And he indicates to the Mary and to John, he says, Mother, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. So he's reconnecting in some senses with family. He's trying to look out for his family. By the time we get to the Acts of the Apostles, it's moved significantly forward. In the Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 1, verse 14, we are told that after Jesus ascends to heaven, the disciples go back into Jerusalem and they're waiting for the Pentecost event. And we are told, it names out the apostles of Jesus, Simon, Peter, and James, and John, and Philip, etc. And then it says, and also with them was the mother of Jesus and his brothers. So at this stage now, the family is kind of having a rethink. They're thinking, maybe this guy was special, so they're hanging out to see what will happen. By chapter 15 of the Acts of the Apostles, we've come 180 degrees. By chapter 15 of the Acts of the Apostles, there's the first council of the church, the Council of Jerusalem, which was held in the year 49 AD to resolve a particular dispute. And everybody has an opinion. Peter gets up and he gives what his opinion is, and John gets up and he says what his opinion is, and Paul gets up and says what his opinion is, and then James, the brother of Jesus, stands up, and he doesn't give an opinion, he gives a decision. Because James, at this stage, is the leader of the new movement. It's not Peter, it's James, the brother of Jesus. James will stand up and he will say, we've heard Simon, i.e. Peter, say this, we've heard John say this, we've heard Paul say this. Now, here is my decision. And then he gives a decision on the issue. So by this stage, 49 AD, the young movement is very firmly in the hands of Jesus' own family. And now they believe in him. Somehow now, his identity has changed significantly from being the momser in chapter 3 in chapter 6 of Mark's Gospel to being the Son of God in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. And side by side with that evolution in the understanding of his family as to who he was, runs his own self-understanding, his own wrestling with his own sense of self. So we find this in Luke's Gospel particularly. There's the great story in Luke chapter 2, where at the age of 12, Jesus goes missing. And he's missing for 3 days, and Joseph and Mary are really upset, and they go back into Jerusalem looking for him, and they come across him in the temple arguing with the scribes and the Pharisees about biblical stuff. And Mary lays into him, puts her hands on her hips and says, where have you been? Don't you realize that your father and I have sought you in sorrow? And he gives her the first rebuff at age 12, and he says, don't you realize that I have to be about my father's business? So he's differentiating between father and father, between earth father or stepfather, whatever word you want to use for it, and the heavenly father. And so when he says here this morning in Thomas's Gospel, when the two become one, then you are a true human being. Unless you hate your father and mother like I hate my father and mother, you can't be my disciples. And unless you love your father and mother as I love my father and mother, you can't be my disciples. So this is like crazy making. What does he mean by that? He's talking about the difference between our core identification in where only God is father and mother to us, and the identification with mere biological family of origin. And unless we're able to differentiate between those and eschew identification with simple biology and identify with spirit, then we haven't understood what it means to be disciples of Jesus Christ. So there was his trajectory. So that's my second point. Third point I want to make is the evolution of the notion of family. So it's crazy making to try to understand this at a surface level. If Jesus is saying to us, unless you hate your father and mother, as I do, you can't be my disciples. And then the next verse is, unless you love your father and mother, as I do, you can't be my disciples. And anybody who knows his father and mother is going to be called the son of the whore. In other words, if you really understand where you're from, and if you really understand who father and mother really is, they will regard you as a bastard, because you'll refuse to play the game, the human game of mere identification with human structures and biological kind of connections to each other. And that's exactly what happened to himself. Because he realized who he really was, he's ostracized. He's not playing the game that they want to play. Now, in the canonical Gospels, there's this great statement where Peter says to him, what about us? We've left our wives and families and kids in order to follow you. What's in it for us? And Jesus says very enigmatically, I guarantee you, Peter, nobody who has left father or mother, wife or husband, children or family, for my sake and for the sake of spreading the gospel, will not receive a reward. You'll receive in this present world many more fathers and mothers and wives and husbands and brothers and sisters, and in the world to come, life everlasting. So what does this mean? If you identify with Jesus and you do Jesus kind of work, if you leave your father and you leave your mother and you leave your husband and you leave your wife and you leave your kids, you're going to get more wives and more husbands and more children and more fathers and more mothers in this world, and in the world to come, life everlasting. For me, it's a very obvious allusion to reincarnation. Christ says, you must disidentify with the family, the present family of origin. They're not your only family. You're not your only biological family. You've been here many times before, and you'll be here many times again. So if you're totally identified with just having one father, one mother, one life, one biological existence, you're not going to get it. If you free yourself from that realization, then you honor them, you love them, but you're not going to identify yourself as the son of anybody, or the brother of anybody, or the wife, or the husband of anybody. Because you've been here many, many times before. And if you're a male this time, you may have been female in a former time. If you're a husband this time, you may have been a wife sometime else. If you were a father this time, you may have been a son. And so if you have the courage to let go of this identification, I'm not saying don't celebrate it, I'm not saying don't honor it, but not to identify with that. You've been in this position many times before and will be in this many times again. And if you can go the next step, the final step is not to identify at all with incarnation or reincarnation. That all of these mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and wives and husbands you've had in all the different incarnations, they're not your identity either. In fact, incarnation itself can't be your identity. This is only a phase. It's a mission that you volunteered for. But your core identity is that you're the child of God. In fact, you're just an articulation of the divine. And so that's the reward outside of this world. Now, did Jesus believe in reincarnation and teach it? Very obviously. He came from a time of Judaism when it was an accepted fact. And there's two great stories in the Gospels where it leaks through, in spite of the Second Council of Constantinople in the year 553 that outlawed the notion of reincarnation. There's a great story in John chapter 9 where Jesus is in the city of Jericho. And as they're leaving the city of Jericho with his disciples, there's a blind man sitting begging at the gates of the city. And he's a well-known character. He's been there always. And as they're passing by, Peter just looks at this blind man and he says, Jesus, I have a question for you. This guy here, was he born blind because of his parents' sin or because of his own sin? Now that question doesn't make any sense unless it's coming out of a context of reincarnation. How can a man be born blind for his own sin? Unless there were a previous incarnation in which he screwed up and somehow, and this is regarded as a punishment. So it was well within the Judaism of the time, reincarnation was an accepted possibility. And then there's the great story in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 17, the story of the Transfiguration, where Jesus is on the mountainside with Peter and James and John, and he has this really powerful vision where Moses and Elijah appear to them. And the vision is so powerful that the other three disciples can see it as well. Now, Moses was dead 1,250 years before Jesus arrived, and Elijah was dead about 800 years before Jesus was born. So they have this powerful vision, and they're really overawed. The three disciples are really overawed. So as they're coming down the mountain afterwards, they turn to Jesus and they say, why do the scriptures tell us that before the Mashiach arrives, before the Messiah comes, Elijah has to come first again? And Jesus says, Elijah has already come back. And they didn't recognize him, but they did with him as they will. And again in parenthesis, Matthew adds in, here Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. So Jesus is making the claim that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah, the 8th century BC prophet. So Jesus would have fully accepted the notion of reincarnation and taught that. So for me, the evolution of the notion of family is to have the courage to go beyond just the biological family in which I find myself in this incarnation, to honor it completely, to love my parents, to be respectful to them, to love my brothers and sisters, but to realize I've been in this situation many times before, and probably many times again, with different mothers and different fathers and different brothers and different sisters. So I'm not going to identify totally with this present family of origin as if they're the only chance I have. And more importantly than that, I'm trying not to identify even with incarnation, that the self I find myself, the spacesuit in which I find myself at this stage, or at any subsequent incarnation, or in any previous incarnation, can't be my core identity. This is just a spacesuit that I needed for a particular kind of mission. So the identification has to go beyond the spacesuit, which brings me to my fourth point. And that's the notion of the evolution of love itself. When I look at the way in which we relate interpersonally, individuals to individuals, I see that as well going through several phases. Initially, you meet somebody that you're really attracted to. And the first level at which you're encountering each other is just persona to persona. The persona is the mask we wear when we're trying to create a good impression on somebody else. We don't believe it of ourselves, but we want you to believe it. I want you to believe that I'm this really happy guy who's, real fun to be around and good looking and whatever. So I'm trying to put out this persona to you. I don't believe it myself, because you see me in the morning at 6 o'clock, I'm a grump. But I want you to see the happy, smiling guy. So initially when people meet, it's the persona meeting a persona. But you can only keep that up for so long. At some stage, the grump is going to come through. At some stage, one of the egos is going to leak through the persona, and you say, oh my God, look at that. Wow. I know there's an imbalance, because one person is still wearing a persona, and the other person is wearing an ego, and they're still trying to relate to each other. And it's a real bad mix. So very, very quickly, the second person lets go of the persona as well, and now there are two egos are meeting, and now you've got fireworks. Two egos trying to love each other is like two people in suits of armor trying to hug. That's how difficult it is, because we're so prickly. The ego is so prickly. But most of us spend our entire lifetimes meeting only ego to ego with a whole bunch of other people, and then wondering, why isn't it working? Yeah? Now, at some stage, one person may be prepared to go a little bit deeper and to start relating not from the level of persona and not from the level of ego, but from the level of soul. So now the soul begins to leak through into the relationship. And at this stage now, it's a soul on one side relating to an ego on the other side. Now that's still a kind of a mix-up. Now, if the second party can be persuaded to let their soul come through, now you've got the ideal relationship. Where you have souls in connection with souls, there is love in contact with love. And that's a very different kind of relationship from a persona in contact with just another persona. And at that stage, we're imitating who God is and how God operates. Because when you look at the Trinitarian formulas that you find in many, many different great spiritual systems, and they're found in many systems, that's what it's about. For me, when I think of the Christian Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, I'm not thinking about a dude with a long grey beard and a guy with holes in his hands and a pigeon. I'm not thinking about that. That for me isn't my definition of Trinity. For me, Father represents isness or being, ontological kind of discrete isness. The Son represents God's total self-knowledge, and the Spirit represents the love that God has for whom she knows herself to be. So for me, Trinity is being, knowing self, and totally loving whom I find myself to be. Though in many different traditions you have the same thinking. Within Hinduism, they will call it Sat, Chit, Ananda. Being, self-knowledge, and bliss. Within Buddhism, the statement will be Buddham Saranam Gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha. Dharmam saranam gacchami, I take refuge in the teaching. Sangam saranam gacchami, I take refuge in the community. So the Trinity within Buddhism is the Buddha who represents source, and the teaching which represents self-knowledge, and the Sangha, or the community, which represents the togetherness and the love of the group. And within Judaism you have the same notion of Trinity. There's a Trinitarian notion in Judaism, and it is the notion of the God who is, who intervenes in human affairs, and who invites us into a covenanted response. So it's the same notion. It's the isness, the knowledge or the revelation, and the invitation then into love. And in our journey back to God, we retrace the steps in the opposite fashion. So where there's being, knowing, and loving, the way back into God is to start with loving, and then knowing, and then being. We make this extraordinary mistake, it seems to me, in our interpersonal relationships, where we think that I can't love you until I first know you. And it's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the opposite. I can't know you until I first love you. The only way I can really know you is to let my soul encounter your soul. And when souls meet, there is only love. And at that level, because you've been recognized at a soul level by my soul, then you're free to know yourself fully and to reveal yourself completely. And then you can be. And then there is only God. So the evolution back into God is to go from loving unconditionally to knowing fully what it's about to being who you really are. And so the evolution at every stage, the lucidity, the radical illuso-lucidity for me is the deep, deep realization at all stages of the day, to try to attempt this at least, no matter what I'm doing, is to try to realize it's an illusion if I think that this is ultimate reality. Because the ultimate reality is that this is a game that God is playing where she is, where she knows, and where she loves.